You to ask yourself two questions right now. First, when you want to learn about colonial societies, would you rather listen to a journalist who has a degree in history and mass communication, or would you see Aisha Speed doing a stream in East Asia? You'd probably say the first, right? But then the second question is where this debate becomes interesting. When you open social media, what do you see on your FYP? What is curated by the algorithm? You'd probably say speed. And then to gain clout from speed, even the influencers that talk about politics talk about the cultural phenomenon that speed is. This is what Hassan Piker does. And then this is how evil the algorithm gets, because that journalist is really out of touch. He doesn't know how Twitch operates, what the algorithm rewards, or isn't just as funny, right? I think then on their side, when you have this influencers on the rise, and I don't want you to believe the LO framing that they challenge, right? They go ahead and say, okay, this is a debate about influencer versus traditional media. Traditional media is really bad. I think all media is bad. What you consume is something that you do unintentionally, right? I think then this debate is about why this regulation is harder on the rise and why this regulation becomes extremely necessary. I'll answer these two questions and I'll extend as to why this rise overall just reduces the quality of journalism that you consume. Why is regulation harder on the rise? It introduces arbitrary measures of what algorithm rewards in terms of journalistic content. It makes regulation harder because information production becomes decentralized. It becomes personality driven and it becomes fragmented along your access to platforms, right? Which means that you no longer have things like editors, you no longer have licenses, you no longer have offices and legal accountability. Millions of individual creators just rapidly repost, react, delete, or like migrate across platforms and jurisdictions, right? This means misinformation can spread faster than regulators can inherently respond. The accountability that you have is extremely unclear because of this rise. But more importantly, platforms can just avoid responsibility by framing these creators as independent voices, because guess what? This is trendy. But the quality on which these people get to be able to have social media attention is that not everyone has the same capacity or skills for this quality to be unlocked. There is things like analysis paralysis, because now you have a lot of information that you're consuming from other sources that is not inherently immediately verified. But second, you're so proximate to them that unintentionally you do end up like consuming these things, because inherently this is trendy and this is what the algorithm is pushing. So I don't consent to seeing the ISO speed being the next one on my feed, but inherently it happens because the guy has 24 million followers. But lastly, this is also unintentional in terms of what the algorithm rewards, which means that this is arbitrary towards not just being the highest quality of journalism being rewarded, but rather what's the immediate and the fastest one. And when you do that, you make a lot of concessions in the processes that journalist houses follows, processes like editorial review, etc., that inherently uphold quality. But second, I think answering the second question is important, because regulation is good because media ecosystems just shape the democratic decision making that you inherently have. Now, I can't avoid my phone, I can't reduce my screen time, but inherently and subconsciously, what I consume on my phone, it does add up to the kind of decisions that I make, right? Without enforceable standards like fact checking or disclosure requirements or liability for defaming someone and moderation, the lowest cost and the most emotionally extreme content can dominate the public discourse. I think then I will just extend to prove that the rise of influencer journalism collapsed the quality of journalism in itself, and then just impact those out. I think that extension is simple. What our core claim is that influencer journalism replaces the ability for you to actually seek truth with the fact that how much the influencer can just optimize the engagement that you have. This is bad because it ended up causing a long-term collapse in the quality and reliability that you can have through these information sources. And these information sources are extremely proximate to you. The mech for this is simple. Absent the rise, when there is a need metric to prove legitimacy, you go through processes like editorial review and fact checking, etc. Right? You have these positive constraints absent this rise because you're a smaller journalist and you have to prove this legitimacy and earn this legitimacy. But you're also battling institutional houses. I think influencer journalism, when it's on the rise, removes these constraints because speed and virality are the business model, right? The algorithm rewards questions like what is more immediate over what is verified, how confidently influencers can report things as opposed to how well researched they are, what appeals to simple emotions instead of complex nuances of issues, right? This means that creators who are like fastest are not necessarily the most informed and accurate ones, but they're the ones who are the most consumable, which is why the arbitrary nature of what people choose to consume is what makes this journalism process extremely bad. Then even if you're well intentioned, either you are forced to take hot takes, etc., or oversimplify things so that you can go to a riser or like larger audience, but also you could have to now probably be outrageous or create viral clips. If you can't do all of that, you will fall behind. But more importantly, I don't think traditional journalists have the same capacity to do so. So the issue is not just isolated misinformation, but the way you reward journalism now just changes completely. I think on comparative, what happens is that you go through all these processes, right? Before I go on extending the impact, I'll take a POI. POI. Okay, all right. Now, what is the impact of this? I think it's threefold. One, the long-term consequence is that you now erode what you can distinguish in terms of information because how relevant social media and influencers can get. You can now have expertise from what charisma is for you as your favorite influencer, which means that these echo chambers and fan bases make it extremely difficult for you to engage in meaningful discourse from other places, right? This probably happened when you had the January 6th United States Capitol attacks, where you had Alan Jones and other influencers who inherently spread conspiracy narratives about a stolen election. And because this discourse existed in echo chambers within their... Yeah, sure, go ahead. Okay.
Right. So if influencers have the incentive to lie for massive views, traditional media institutions also are influenced by ratings, political
Yeah, this
boundary.
debate is not about traditional versus influencer journalism. I don't know why you're asking that. This debate is inherently about on what side this journalism happens in a more responsible manner. When you're a smaller influencer, you have a more threshold that you have to cross, and you're more responsible. But secondly, these things looks like COVID-19 vaccine misinformation, probably the way Joe Rogan did it, right? But I think second impact is simple. Real journalism is now economically unsustainable, which means that investigative reporting is expensive. Reaction content is cheaper, and audiences increasingly reward these as of now when there's a trend. This is why many local newsrooms now inherently have to adopt strategies like what is more viral, and commentary creators inherently still outdo them because they just thrive by reacting to stories that are uncovered by actual journalists, right? This is what Guys and like Phantom does. But society then also loses institutions capable of doing real things that journalism can do. Third impact is simple. Journalism becomes more performative because influencers have to depend on things like engagement, loyalty, etc. Which means that now they're incentivized to make journalism more dramatic, more personality centered, and more outrage driven. These are things that collide with your influencer identity and inherently reduce your ability to do actual journalism. I think for all those reasons, you should believe this has done more harm than good.